we'll record this so that we can post it up in the app as sort of additional content for everybody. The reason for doing this video was really just we get quite a few questions about minority roll-up. So I know when we're doing the Harbour Club and we're kind of deep in the pit of all that information, we kind of sail through some of the deal structures, and you either catch it or you're still thinking about the last one that I was talking about. So I wanted to have a little bit of a deeper explanation on minority roll-ups, because I think it's a very powerful tool that a few people have used, but not many people have used it really effectively within the community. And I think if they understand it better, it could be deployed a lot more effectively. So I think the first thing to start from is to just explain the kind of concept behind a minority roll-up. Obviously, a traditional roll-up is where a parent company, which would normally be the SPV that you've created, goes and acquires a bunch of subsidiary companies. A minority roll-up is where you acquire a minority stake, lots of subsidiaries. However, using the agreements that we have enough control over those subsidiaries that we can account for all of their revenue and profits up into the top co. And to understand how that works, it's important to understand consolidated accounting. So consolidated accounting is very simply a parent company's balance sheet and profit and loss is effectively all of the profit and losses and balance sheets of subsidiaries added together, good or bad, so positive or negative. If you've got your mics on and some feedback, I think I found who it is. I've muted you. So I'll just mute a couple of others that I've noticed are muted as well, so some new people have joined us. So basically the concept with consolidated accounting is you may be familiar when you look through things like Companies House or some of the credit checking tools that you get on in the UK. You'll see this thing of person of significant control or entity of significant control. That basically is a note that you have to put in the account. By the way, this is an international rule, so all around the world now they're adopting this standard of transparency to basically show who the ultimate beneficial owners of incorporated entities is. Now, what's interesting is that if you have a company sitting above another company, if it's deemed to be of significant control, it can report all of the profit and loss and all of the revenue and all of the accounts up there. Now, if you don't have significant control, let's say you were normally just a 10% shareholder, you would just be accounting for 10% of every year. So if you had your company and you bought 3 10% stakes in 3 $1 million revenue businesses, you would account from each of those 3 entities. So your parent company would be reporting 300 grand a year revenue. However, if you owned 51% in each of those companies, you would be reporting the full 1 million. So as soon as you got to 51%, you would be reporting 3 million in revenue up in the top co. Now, within the accounts, when you read deeper into the accounts, you do then see the offset, which is for the 49% that you don't own. But kind of the point here is showing this big kind of headline. It means you can then go out and market a $3 million business for sale. Now, one of the things I found out, and it was more or less by accident quite a number of years ago, was I was tightening up my agreements, the belt and the braces, and then sewing my shirt to my trousers. And what I noticed, or what I found out, was when I went through an audit, the auditor pointed out to me that actually, even though I had a minority stake in this business, I was the ultimate beneficial controller of it, because the kind of knot of control that I had over the directors of the other company, they actually couldn't act completely freely as directors because of these things that they had to come and ask me for. So that was deemed to give me that position of significant control, which meant that I could consolidate all the accounts. And that got me really interested, because that made me realize that actually, if you put a group together on that basis, you could then go out and market the whole thing for sale. So just to remind you, the key clauses that we get into every agreement. I mean, if you go into the sort of data room on the app where we've got all the documents in there, it's that the clauses are in basically all of those letter agreements. So whether it's the letter of agreement for a merger or the letter of agreement for a WIBO or a BIBO, you'll find that the terms are the same. And it's basically, you have the dividend policy, which is control over what happens to the profits. You have the preemption and drag and tag rights, which is what happens in the event of a sale. You have the reserved matters, and I think it's the reserved matters that give the most weight to this person of significant control factor. And the reserved matters are basically where you say that here's a list of things that if you want to do them, you have to seek permission from me first, or to get approval of 100% of the shareholders first. And it's things like you can't lend money, you can't borrow money, you can't sell assets, you can't change the name of the company, dispose of, change the core nature of the business, all of those kind of things. So there's a whole bunch of stuff in there that they're then restricted from doing without asking your permission. And that's really the critical one, because if the agreement is between your SPV and that company, you might only have a 10% stake in the company. They're supposed to be the directors that are running that company, but actually if they want to borrow money, lend money, sell assets, change the name of the company, change what the business does on a daily basis, liquidate the company, any of those things, they have to come back and ask your permission. And it was that the auditor highlighted meant that the holding entity became an entity of significant control. So once you've identified your SPV as being as having some significant control, and by the way, this can be like benign dictatorship. You never have to enforce any of these clauses. You can pretty much let them do what they like down in the bottom company, but you have this enforcement sitting there legally in writing. So you can be a sort of a benign dictator, but because you have this, you can put this note in their accounts when it comes to beneficial ownership, which is one of the key declarations you now have to have in a set of accounts when you file them, and that gives you that control. So understanding this ability to take a minority stake in a company, or more importantly, a minority stake in several companies, but then account for 100% of their revenue and 100% of their profit can be quite powerful, because many of you before coming on the Harbour Club probably heard an interview I did with a guy where we talked about the virtual merger strategy. And the virtual merger strategy is quite exciting because you can put a bunch of quite big companies together and then go out and do, a big sort of private equity deal or a go public deal or something like that. The challenge with a virtual merger is that if that transaction falls away, and they often do, you're left with nothing. So you try and put this huge thing together, and it's kind of like herding cats to get them through to the exit. And if you don't succeed to get them through to the exit, the whole thing basically falls apart, and you're left, having invested lots of time and money and energy, but without anything to show for it. With the minority roll-up, even if you don't find a buyer straight away, or you don't have an exit route straight away, you do still retain the ownership in the companies, the rights to dividends, the ability to sell the whole thing forever and ever going forwards. So it's a much more sustainable way to use your time to take these stakes in these companies. So how do you take stakes in companies? Well, there's so many different ways that you can do this, and you might have some ideas already. But I mean, for example, if you already provide some kind of consultancy or some kind of service to businesses, then a sweat equity stake is a really easy place to start. So it might well be going through their balance sheet and helping them with some financial engineering. It could be through improving sales and marketing. It could be through cost savings. Could be through implementing the LLP, quite a common structure that people use in the UK is to implement that LLP structure and take a stake based on that. It could just be purely on the schmoozing basis. So you literally make friends with them and convince them to give you a share in your business, to have your advice and your counsel on their board. You could even just share with the fact that if we put a group of companies together, you can share resources and you can increase the overall value for everybody. So pointing out to people that a small or a big company is worth a lot more than 10 small companies individually. So let's go out and put 10 together. There's lots of synergies that we can get, plus there's a huge valuation arbitrage that we could get. Or you could pitch a go public solution. So you could say, let's get 3 or 4 of us together, go public, and then we can add lots more in later. So it's a really good, all of those things are really a really good foot in the door to take that initial stake in a company. And you only need, it could be 10%, 20%, 30%, 40%. People always ask me what's the right percentage to ask for, and I always have to answer, hey, look, it's whatever you can get away with. I remember I actually did about. So what I tended to find in my early days of doing deals is I would get a deal structure in my mind that worked, and I would repeat that deal several times over, and then basically I'd think of a better way of doing it, and then do a bunch that all looked the same. So I had several deals that would look the same kind of in batches before I got kind of, I guess, a bit more creative, and actually coming up with the right solution for the other person. So I think I always used to just sell the solution I had. Whereas now I probably think a little bit more about what's right for them, which is a better way to do it. But when I started, I just used to do this asset-only purchase, so like the IT company, the telecoms company. I used to just buy the assets, move them into my telco, and off we go. And then I did a series of deals where I would take a 50% stake in the company in exchange for them utilizing services that we provided. So, introduction to new clients, back office accounting and admin that we did through one of our subsidiary companies, and this kind of little suite of services and support that we would give them. And so this was hugely attractive to smaller companies with less than kind of 20 employees who are looking for that extra support to help them grow. And and I probably did that, half a dozen times before I came up with a better structure. But what was really interesting is when I did the very, very first Harbour Club back in 2009, they were, the majority of my case studies then were those two deal structures, plus a couple of others that I'd done through kind of administration and insolvency. And Craig came along to the second ever Harbour Club in 2009, and basically heard exactly that pitch, and went and met a company and took an 80% stake in the company. And I kind of sat down and tried to figure out with him what the difference was between the way he'd presented it and the way that I had presented it. And fundamentally what it boiled down to was that he'd asked for 80%, I was asking for 50%. And actually, apart from that, there was almost nothing in it. So it really was just down, when people ask what's the right percentage is kind of a little bit of whatever you can get away with. But also a little bit of what's right for that other person. So I think in the instance with Craig's one, that person was really overwhelmed and wanted a lot of support, whereas perhaps some of the ones that I'd done, maybe they were a little bit more bullish and a little bit more positive about their businesses. But the great thing with the minority roll-up is that you can target solvent, well-run, good businesses and still get a stake, particularly using a kind of consulting shareholding, because you can link your consulting shareholding to performance. And you can also include, if you're trying to get that first deal done, because you've heard me talk about deal virginity being so important. If you're trying to get that first deal done, you can always do what I call risk reversal, which is where you give them the opportunity to unwind that position if it isn't as successful as you think it's going to be. So for example, if you think you can save them 100 grand a year on their services spend and they're making 200 grand a year of profit, then you might say to them, look, you're making 200 grand a year at the moment. How about I get your profit from 200 to 300 grand? You give me 15% of your company, and we put a small group together that we can then take public, and we can all make a lot more money. Obviously, with your much higher profit, your remaining share is worth, exponentially more. And by putting together with this group, it's going to be worth even more still. So you can create quite a compelling argument. And then the kind of final close could then be the risk reversal. And by the way, if I don't achieve this within 6 months of the date of signing the heads of terms, you have the right to buy my shares back off me for $1. So you effectively create a path of least resistance into the transaction, a risk reversal so that they have a nice way of escape. When you're talking them through the contract clauses, you can explain on every single one of those clauses how it benefits them just as much as it benefits you. If you remember, in fact, I think I might have already done a video on this that you can probably watch on the app. But if you remember, you have, the dividend clause. If they're going to be the 85% shareholder and you're the 15% shareholder in this scenario, they're going to get an awful lot more of the dividends than you are. So it benefits them more than it benefits you to have those dividends in place. The dragon tag and preemption rights are really important, because if anybody ever wants to sell the company, having another shareholder involved who is intransigent could just completely block the sale. So having that in place benefits everybody. It's a win-win clause. It doesn't suffer from author bias. Then you have the reserve matters, which, as I said earlier, was the kind of killer application, if you like, the killer clause that we think helps us with this consolidation piece. But actually that affects them as well, because they wouldn't want you to be borrowing money on behalf of the company or lending money from the company to people or selling off its assets or changing its name or any of those things. So it kind of protects them as much as it protects you from an implementation perspective. The difference being that you tend to be non-executive and your shares are held by another legal entity. And that's the difference, is that they then have to ask that legal entity for permission. So that's where the kind of nuance of control comes from. And of course, the final one, which I didn't mention earlier, is you have this compete clause in there as well. And the compete clause is also a valuable one, because you wouldn't want, or they wouldn't want you to come into the business, understand who the best employees were, steal those employees and take some customers with you and run off into the sunset with all the good bits, if you like. So getting people over the line to enter into those agreements is a lot more straightforward than you think, because, like I say, it's kind of win-win. So it's relatively easy to walk people through why they should be doing that. The way to take the stake in the business is relatively straightforward, because it's a sort of path of least resistance. And like I say, if you're feeling a bit green or you're not quite sure how you would do this, the easiest way is to do some kind of sweat equity, some kind of earn your way into the business with a risk reversal to earn your way back out. You can always have other clauses in there that allow you to take a bigger stake later on if you want. But the key thing is, once you've got that first company in the group, it then gives you an awful lot of credibility to go and speak to the second and the third. You know, when you're talking to, I remember when we were putting the original marketing group together, and you're speaking to probably 15, 20 different marketing agencies about putting a group of marketing agencies together. It's kind of like the school disco, where everybody's standing around the edge and nobody's dancing. And as soon as you could get that first person to get up and dance, the rest of it kind of started to take off. And it was really after that first one. And do you know what the bizarre thing with the marketing group was as well? The first one that signed was actually one that didn't actually go ahead. Which is always the irony. So the first one that signed was a sports sponsorship company. And in fact, they had a terrible legal dispute with one of their key sponsors, and we just couldn't take them public with this potential legal action hanging over their head. But anyway, having them on board, it was a really decent sized business. It was quite the event that their main event that they promoted was very well known. So that really helped as well get other people to join. And in fact, even after they dropped out, we had 7 people in the group. And by the time we went public, we had 4 in the group. So, you know, for various reasons along the way, we ended up excluding one company because they couldn't pass their audit, and we ended up excluding another company because the guy actually had, again, some personal legal issues, nothing to do with the business or sponsors or anything like that. So it is a little bit like herding cats, trying to get all these businesses to kind of to cling together. But we got the 4 of them together and we listed it. Now, equally, that could be achieved through the minority roll-up. So yeah, approaching these companies, taking a stake, adding some value, and then bringing in the next one and the next one and the next one. Just a final point, I guess, on synergies. So, and by the way, there's a chat screen. If you click on the bottom, you'll see it says chat. You can click on that chat icon. I see somebody said good evening and so hello, and please mute your mics. That was good advice, Stephen. If anybody wants to ask any questions, just type your question into that chat box, and when I come to the end of the discussion here, I'll answer as many questions as I can on the topic, just so that you everybody gets the kind of full understanding. So please do type those questions and make sure that everybody gets the maximum from this, or just say hi if you don't want to, just to check you're alive. Yeah, then the kind of final bit on it, I guess, is synergies. So a lot of people get obsessed with this idea that if you're going to put this little group together, well, let's centralize some stuff. The really common mistake I see is creating like a new brand at the topco level. and trying to create some kind of relationship with clients or people in the big wide world under that brand, or trying to create centralized functions for things. So putting in an accounts or admin function at the top, or putting in an accounts or admin function at the or a sales function is quite a common one, where people are sticking in a centralized sales function. In my experience, I've never seen that really work very well. The better option is always to keep the decentralization. So let these businesses, if one of them has a really good finance function, let them communicate with each other and see if they want to share some resources between them. Remember, if you impose anything on them, it will be a really terrible idea, and they'll fight and they'll kick and they'll scream through the process. Sometimes deliberately making sure it doesn't work, just to show you what a terrible idea it was. Whereas when you sit them in a room, they will come up with 50 more ideas than you thought of as to how they can collaborate and how they can work more closely together. And because it's their idea, it's the best fucking idea ever. So they actually go and implement it, and they will then work until midnight to prove to you that it was a great idea and that it should work. So the synergies are often better coaxed out of people rather than forced upon people. And I've often found that when you try and create that central function, all you're doing is creating a layer of cost, which then has to be financed somehow. So you then become the person that's asking them for money all the time, and they just find that really, really annoying. And then using a new brand or creating a new brand at the top co level. Basically, I mean, if you think about doing a startup, one of the hardest things with doing a startup is getting people to understand who you are and what you're about and all of that sort of stuff. And so effectively you're taking a bunch of mature businesses that are already known in the marketplace, already have relationships with clients, suppliers, and that people have generally heard of. And you're trying to then do a startup from scratch to go and sell those well-established brands to people. It's an ego trip. I know people, lots of people like that. It's this kind of empire building kind of thing, but it's a huge waste of time and effort. You can, you can do much better with it. So let's just have a look. Examples of case studies, industry. So I know people that are doing minority roll-ups in recruitment. I know people that have done, they've done whole acquisitions of companies and then added other companies through a minority, which is an interesting option to look at. So I've seen one of those in IT. There's a couple of really random industries that are doing that as well, where you have a couple of existing decent sized companies. They perhaps spoke to 3 or 4 others, but couldn't get a deal to acquire them outright. So they've taken a stake instead. So they're still creating a group from a kind of headlines perspective, but yeah, not a pure kind of minority roll up. So I think there are loads of industries where you could do this. So I think there's so many industries where scale is a massive advantage. So I mean, I've mentioned marketing services. The top 200 marketing companies in the world, 198 of them are roll-ups. So of the 200 biggest, 198 are roll-ups. So it's an industry that's very accustomed to these kind of transactions. And positioning this one in this way is just a slightly different twist on that idea, which I think they can find pretty appealing. But any fragmented industry, I mean, the blue collar ones are always relatively easy. They've been looking for a way to exit. If you're in the UK and you've got that LLP strategy, then any business that has lots of vehicles and lots of reasonably paid people, so engineering services, air conditioning, anything where there's people going out and servicing stuff and doing stuff, you can add so much money back to the bottom line so quickly. It's relatively easy to get the stake, and of course there could be lots and lots of synergies between them. In fact, we've got 2 that we're talking to at the moment. It won't be a minority roll up. It'll be a listing, but 2 facilities management businesses where things like insurance, fleet, all of those kind of things would just have so much potential crossover. They reckon they can find $1 million of extra profit a year just in synchronizing fleet, where one person has a van going to Wembley on a particular day. They don't need to have both companies sending a van to Wembley on that day. So that there's all sorts of efficiencies like that they can find between them. So next one here is most of my deals are the free equity for my consulting advice. Yeah, you have 11 now. Fantastic. Right, let's take them public. Do you have a specific agreement for these where I can simply change the equity amount? So we have the WIBO and the BIBO agreement on the USB and on the sort of repository of information, and that's really the best agreement. It actually doesn't change much at all for a minority roll-up, because effectively it's the same SPV, just another company. So it's actually the same agreement, but with a different target added to it. Now, if you've got several companies in the same sector where you have a minority, there's no reason why you couldn't get their permission to move those minority stakes into one holding company, and have that conversation with them about how about we flip this into a public company, or how about we look at an exit as a group together. And I'd be more than happy to have that conversation with you about how we, how you could look at doing that as an exit route. Is there a minimum shareholding you need to take to make it work, or do the clauses mean that it will work with even 10 to 20%? Yeah, I mean, literally, the clauses would work with a 1% or a single share. Basically, the obligations would be identical. The difference, I guess, is whether the juice is worth the squeeze. So, 1% of a company worth 100 grand is a grand. So it's about making the percentage enough that the juice is worth the squeeze. Yeah, you want a decent 6 or 7 figure valuation for the stake that you take to make the whole thing worth doing. Somebody put, here is the call being recorded to put on the app. Yep, we'll post this in the app in the bonus content section. Now, we also have another webinar which is restricted, which we're doing next week, which will be posted after the Singapore event. So we have Los Angeles in February, then we have the UK in March, then we have Singapore in April, and then after that we'll be publishing another bonus video inside the app, which is, we're calling it Strategy 13. As you know, on the Harbour Club there's 12 strategy, no money down strategies. Actually in 2020 there's 14, but Strategy 13 is a bit of a game changer in terms of wealth creation for you guys. You might have seen a video that I posted talking about creating 50 new millionaires during 2020. Well, effectively, Strategy 13 is the way that I think we'll create an awful lot of those millionaires. So we'll be presenting that strategy live at the LA, London, and Singapore event, and then we'll be publishing it to the whole community. So you'll all be able to have a full understanding of exactly how that works. In terms of selling the minority roll-up, do you add the seller financing option into the mix? You can do, yeah. So you can have the loan company that can provide some of the finance for the ultimate buyer. The other place where it can be useful to use the loan company is actually under the contract clauses. The subsidiaries have the right to buy themselves back out. So if they're perhaps not minded to go with some kind of final exit, you can suggest that they buy your minority out before you sell the rest of the group, so that you get them really on board with the idea of going with the whole thing. Particularly, let's say you wanted to do an RTO, so you wanted to take the group public. If one of them just kind of went, "Meh, it's not really for me," you can kind of force them under the dragon tag rights, but it's not really, you can't really force a small business to do anything ultimately when it comes down to it. So you can legally compel them, but it's very hard to actually make people do things they don't want to. So giving them the option to buy out straight away with the loan company to support the acquisition, like an MBO style, to take your shareholding out, can be one way of getting rid of anybody that doesn't want to go along with the party. Just dealing with that basically. In terms of the legal docs just referred, are they available in the HC app? Yes, within the app, I think it's the tab's called Documents or something like that. So yeah, you click on that tab and all the agreements are in there. Now, there's Letter of Agreement, which has the 5 key clauses in it, but then I think we do have one specifically for WIBO, BIBO. And it's that taking a stake and having those control elements that's the real key to the strategy. Obviously, don't just change the names. You do need to read the text and make sure that it's appropriately drafted for the deal that you're doing. Yeah, seems like a very sweet way of marketing the roll-up as well. Yeah, I mean, it's quite, look, loads of people can see the value in creating a roll-up. It's a really obvious way of, building a larger group of businesses and therefore a larger value and greater shareholder value for everybody. But how you do it is really quite tricky, because the traditional private equity model is just to borrow tons and tons of money. And if you look at the debt-fueled roll-ups that have been done throughout history, an awful lot of them end up failing. And they end up failing for something that, you've heard me talk about quite a lot, I think, which is that when you borrow money to buy a small to medium-sized business, what you tend to do is that you're taking your forward cash flow and you're giving it to your star employee so they can leave. And so what you end up is you have to run the whole thing. And so what quite often happens is these private equity companies pay too much, they borrow too much, and then they stuff all these 20-year-old MBA students in there to run the company, who have no idea really how to run a company, but they've learned a lot about it at school. And it turns into an unmitigated disaster, because you've got rid of this person who understands the industry, understands the stuff and the staff and the customers, and he probably does the job of 3 people for the salary of half a person, and you've just given him a chunk of money, possibly for him to be retained, but he doesn't stick around for very long because he's got to work for this stupid 20-year-old MBA, and he's got millions of pounds in the bank. So he runs for the hills, and the business doesn't fare so well thereafter. The great thing about the minority roll-up is you've still got the full engagement of the existing management team. You've still got their brand, their culture, everything they've created. And so you can really just focus on, the joint ventures, the mergers, the acquisitions, and the exits. All those things that I talked about are, real shareholder value things to be doing on a day-to-day basis. You can just go out and just do that. You're non-executive, you don't want to be involved in the business, you don't have to be involved in the businesses, you're just involved in the value creation and the exit part of it. And that's quite appealing for the entrepreneur as well, because they know that there's value in creating a group, and they know that there's value in working more closely with the other members, and they would all like some sort of capital event in the future. And so effectively you can give them that as a sort of a nicely packaged up solution that they can then run with. So somebody's asking here, thanks for the call the other day regarding REITs, no problem. Quick question, if you're buying a property, okay, for say for 3 million and with a rent roll of 500K from a conglomerate, how would you best split the shareholding within the REIT from investors and your own equity? Yeah, so tricky one. So this is a question about REITs and a question about businesses with real estate. So just a very quick answer to the question. The way we normally do it is we would spin the business out into a separate entity, because you don't want to move the property because you have stamp duty and lots of other issues with that. The property is then owned by a limited company. So you are a shareholder in the limited company that owns the property, and that's where you would carve out your stake. And then the business that you've spun out pays a rent for the property, and it's that rent to the property that dictates the value of the property. As a rough rule of thumb, with a standard lease in place, a property is worth 10 times its annual rent. So if the private company is paying $1 million a year in rent, the property is worth 10 million. If you tweak the rent up to 1.2 million, the property is now worth 12 million. What could possibly go wrong? But that is genuinely, unbelievably, how a lot of commercial property transactions work. But yeah, you would have a stake effectively in the company that owns the real estate, and the valuation is dictated by the rental income. And then if you're pushing that company that has the rental income into a conglomerate or into some other entity, obviously the rent it pays reduces its profit. So you would reduce the value of the operating business by increasing the rent. So there's a little game that you play between property valuation and business valuation. But remember, 100 grand knocked off the profit in the company probably reduces its value by 300 to 500 grand, but increases the property by $1 million. So you tend to go fairly bullish on the rental income, I would imagine. So any more for any more? I think that gives us a reasonable position there. I hope you can see just from that re-explanation, I hope that opens your eyes under a re-explanation to how powerful a strategy that can actually be. It's I always talk about doing deals. If you can find a path of least resistance to getting a deal done, then that's always the best route to take. And I think this is one of those strategies where you really can create that path of least resistance. Look, don't get me wrong, nothing is ever easy. You have to spend time building the relationship with the target. You have to create genuine value in order to get that stake, or else they're going to resent it forever. And you have to execute on that process. But yeah, the juice is worth the squeeze. You can create significant groups without having to come up with any kind of capital. And you can have a fairly significant kind of exit at the end of it all. So I will leave it there for now. Thank you very much for spending the time to join me. And of course, if you have more questions, you can also post them under the video in the app, and we'll get around to those as well, and make sure that everybody's questions are answered. So have a lovely evening. I'm going to stop the recording there.